In 1987, the Soviets convinced the Angolan that it was time to launch an offensive, a major offensive in the southeast. From this town of Cuito Cuanavale, which was the southernmost town controlled by the Angolan troops in the southeast of the country, all the way to the border with Namibia, all the way into the area controlled by Savimbi, where you had the capital, between quotation marks, of Savimbi, the village of Jamba, etc., etc. This had already been attempted by the Angolans with Soviet support in 1985 and had failed. The Cuban had opposed it in 85. They opposed it in 87, saying it's a wrong approach. This is an area controlled by the South African Air Force. The Angolan don't have anti-aircraft weapons strong enough. If they're advancing, threatening Savimbi, the South African Air Force will intervene. This is what happened in 85. In 87, the Soviets said, no, no, no. Now the Angolans have anti-aircraft weapons that are powerful enough. They convinced the Angolans, and the offensive began from Cuito Cuanavale south. Let me say one thing now. All what I'm going to say now is based on South Africans, on a triptych of documents, three kinds of documents, from the Cuban archives, the South African archives, and the US archives. And the interesting thing is that fundamentally they say the same thing. Plus Soviet sources, the memoirs of the Soviet military advisors who were with the Angolan units that advanced in this offensive from Cuito Cuanavale. And what these sources say is that the Angolan army, the FAPLA, was progressing well. Actually, they were fighting better than UNITA, better than the troops of Savimbi. South African documents from the South African archives expressed the irritation of the South African commanders because of the poor performance of the troops of Savimbi, how the Angolan, the FAPLA, the government troops are performing better. And they are getting closer and closer, the Angolan troops, to Mavinga, the most important town controlled by Savimbi. And that's when the South Africans intervene. They intervene with Air Force, they intervene with ground troops. And they hit the Angolan hard, and the Angolans start retreating towards Cuito Cuanavale. And by late October 1987, these Angolan troops are basically surrounded in the town of Cuito Cuanavale. Let me say something. In general, the Angolan army was not a good army. These troops that had participated in the offensive towards Mavinga, Jamba, about 12,000 men, were the best troops of the Angolan army, by far the best. If these troops were to surrender or collapse, it would have been a terrible blow for the government in Angola. And the situation was all the more complicated because in order to supply Cuito Cuanavale, where the troops had withdrawn, the Angolan government could not supply them by air because the air was controlled by the South Africans. They could supply them only by road. There was only one road, one communication link, a paved road that went from Cuito Cuanavale to the town of Menongue in the west. It was about 180 kilometers. And the supplies were becoming increasingly difficult because the South African Air Force was strafing the road, and the South Africans controlled the air. The reports that we have, the reports of the South Africans who were surrounding Cuito Cuanavale, the reports of the Soviet military advisors who were at Cuito Cuanavale, and Cuban documents reflecting conversations with Angolan generals all say the same. Cuito Cuanavale was going to fall. And Cuito Cuanavale would have fallen if the Cubans had not intervened. Until 1987, the Cubans had a problem. The Cubans felt, of course, very threatened by the Reagan administration, so they kept their best planes, their best pilots, their best tanks, their best anti-aircraft weapons at home in fear of a US aggression. And they sent to Angola what they felt they did not really need at home. What you have in the United States in late 1986 is the Iran-Contra scandal. The Iran-Contra scandal weakened the Reagan administration. From the point of view of Cuba, Reagan was defunct by the Iran-Contra scandal. He had to fire some of the most aggressive members of his administration, etc., etc. And this meant that the Cubans concluded that they could afford to send what they had in Cuba to Angola, because the danger of a US aggression against Cuba, against the island, had disappeared. As Fidel said in one meeting with his top generals, the war is there now, in Angola, it's not here. The background of all this is that the Soviets had refused to give Cuba the weapons the Cubans needed to launch an offensive in the southwest against the South Africans, something that the Cubans had been requesting since 1985. Every time a top Cuban delegation went to the Soviet Union, or top Soviet officials went to Cuba, like Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, the Cubans kept saying, give us the planes, give us the weapons. We have two fronts, the United States and Angola. We cannot do it with our own weapons. Give us the weapons. And the phrase the Cubans used time and again was cortarle las garras a los surafricanos in Angola, to cut the claws of the South Africans in Angola. And this would also mean a huge psychological assistance to the ANC, the African National Congress of South Africa, etc., etc. But the Soviets didn't give the weapons. And the reason why the Soviets didn't give the weapons, this was the impression of the Cubans, and Gorbachev says something in that direction in his memoirs, is because the Soviets were afraid if the Cubans had the weapons they wanted and advanced to the Namibian border, pushed the South Africans out, the Cubans might not stop at the Namibian border and might enter into Namibia to free Namibia, which is something the Cubans would have liked to do. And so there would be a Cuban escalation. But with Iran-Contra, Cuba decides that they now can launch an offensive even without the Soviet weapons, sending what they have in Cuba, because they no longer fear an attack by the United States. And so this is what happens. Cuba sends to Angola, beginning in late November 1987, its best planes, its best pilots, its anti-aircraft weapons, the mobile anti-aircraft systems, the best Cuba has, plus a reinforcement of 17,000 soldiers. But the most important are the weapons. And so you have two things, to make a long story short. One is the defense of Cuito Cuanavale. And I can't understand how there is still a debate about Cuito Cuanavale. It's just an example of the bias and the laziness of European scholars and American scholars, because the documents are in the South African archives. There is no reason to have a discussion about Cuito Cuanavale, because the South African documents tell the entire story, and they're there in Pretoria. And what they say is that the Cuban Air Force gained the upper hand in the skies of Cuito Cuanavale by mid-late December 1987. Overall, the Cubans were loyal to the Angolans, even with Gorbachev. In a book that just came out, the author says that Gorbachev essentially sold out Angola. This is not true. Gorbachev made his agreements with the Americans, but on Angola he was loyal to the Soviet commitment. The Soviet commitment was to support the Angolan government. The Soviets had a military mission, which was about 1,000 men, and they provided the weapons. What I'm trying to say is essentially this. At some key moments, the Soviets failed to respond. The South African invasion in 1975, and they opposed the Cuban intervention in the Southwest in 1987. But overall, the Soviet behavior was very good. I think that overall the Soviet Union has a very good record in Southern Africa. The Soviet Union was on the side of the angels, whereas the United States was on the side of the devil, and is one of the most honorable pages in Soviet foreign policy.